is Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So let's do a 420. Let's do a 420. Let's talk about the Christian God. The Christian God, the fire bringer, the doom bringer. You know, the God of whatever. When I was younger, like a lot of people, my mom dragged me to church, and you had to sit there and listen to the singing. You had to sit there and listen to the pastor, and him, you know, does a show. And at the end, you give them money. And then you go about your week, and you can curse and everything else the rest of the week. Until you go on Sunday again and you replenish whatever. There is a fundamental contradiction built into the Christian God that whether they realize it or not, it doesn't, either their God is not what they think their God is, or their God is absolutely monstrous. And they need to explain to me which one it is. So, based upon the Christian God model, you have this being who sits up high, who sees all, knows all, is everywhere. He's omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. He knows all and essentially is all. For whatever reason, that particular God got lonely. Either he got lonely or he was an egomaniac. Whichever one it was, he created something to worship himself. Now, whatever that means for the psychology of something, to create something purely to worship you, whatever you want to add to that. Ultimately, the idea goes, he created a person. And in creating that person, he essentially created souls. Those particular people had incarnations on earth. We're stuck with the problem, though. If God is omnipotent, if God is omnipresent, omniscient, he knows everything, he is everything, and he creates a person, and he gives that person free will, there is an inherent contradiction in a God who knows all, giving the person free will. What I mean is, if the individual has free will, the individual will make choices to do whatever that person wants. Ideally, that's the whole point of free will. You have choice. You are a being of choice. Now, this doesn't necessarily stop God from being omnipresent or omniscient, meaning just because that person can do whatever that person wants, the only requirement in that case is that God knows what the person is going to do. He's God. There has to be a requirement of it. This idea of time and space or properties of our particular reality, per se. God should know those things. Meaning that the moment that a person incarnates on a life, as that person is being formed in the first place, however that soul is created, God knows the history and the future of that particular soul. He has to. If that soul also has free will, and if God is also going to pass judgment on that soul, if that soul fucks up through the course of its life, did God not know that that particular soul was going to fuck up? And not just that, if God didn't necessarily know that the soul was going to fuck up, and he let that soul go through it anyway, meaning God knew, God still went through this charade of life. Why is God going through the charade of life? God already knows what that person is going to end up being. Now, even if you make the case that say, well, God loves that person, and God wants to let that person run amok in life, meaning the very act of having experience to some degree has a certain value. So whether God knew that person was going to fuck up or not was irrelevant to the process. Ultimately, God wanted that person the ability to experience. Okay, but we're still stuck with an issue. God is wrathful. He's an angry dad. If you don't do what God tells you to do, he's pretty autocratic in that way. He confines you to a burning pit of hell. Now, this is pretty sadistic on a few fronts. A, you've told me that God knows everything, is everywhere. He's omniscient, omnipresent. He is all there is. There is nothing that exists outside of God, not even knowledge. Meaning that God created somebody that God full well knew was going to fuck up. And even though God full well knew that person was going to fuck up, God still went through the charade of letting that person go through a life as if that person had free will. Yes, foreknowledge doesn't necessarily mean that the individual doesn't have free will. What I'm getting at is the fact that the person had free will and the fact that that person made choices that landed him on God's shit list But God knew he was going to be on this shit list. God created a being that was imperfect. And based upon Christian dogma, he created a being purely for the sake of burning in hell. That's ultimately what you're telling me. This is not a situation to which God didn't know. Now, if God knew, God created him anyway. That's pretty sadistic. That's pretty sadistic. That would be like me creating a software program and me saying, I'm going to create a program and I'm going to give that program a certain degree of sentience. And I'm going to allow that program to make certain choices. Now, I created the algorithm for that particular program, meaning I created this matrix. So I know the degree of choices he's going to make. I understand how he's going to weigh things, even though that particular individual thinks he's making choices on free will. And maybe, hey, to some degree, maybe it is free will. But ultimately, I still understand that that particular thing, that model, that whatever that program is, it's making choices. But it's making choices based upon predefined biases and rule sets. So yes, he's making a choice in the sense of free will, but that free will is still governed by the things that I've built into him. Meaning I know with some certainty what that thing is going to do. Meaning I already know the choices it's going to make and whether or not it's going to end up on my bad side. I take it another step and I come up with some way to torture that particular existence. Now understand how sick this is. You created something out of nothing. You created an existence. You gave it awareness. You gave it some degree of consciousness that it could observe and be aware of its particular environment. And being aware and observing that particular environment, that consciousness has certain things that it says, I like this or I dislike this. Just by being aware, yes, it's a natural bias to go towards things that make you feel good and things that you're going to like. And the same token, it is just as adamant, if not more so, to stay away from things that you do not want to be a part of. In this particular case, God came up with a torture scheme of eternal damnation. Now imagine the situation where I created a program. I create something that I know will uniquely torture that particular program when that program gets on my bad side, that I myself, because I built that program, already know that that program is going to end up on my bad side, even though that program believes it has free choice. Now, within certain guidelines, that program can make a choice, but ultimately I programmed in the biases and everything else, meaning I understand what that thing is going to end up doing. Meaning I already know whether he's going to be on my shit list or whether he's going to be on my good side. If I'm also taking the extra step of creating a torture chamber, and I'm saying, I'm going to create a situation that this program believes that in every second, 1,000 years pass, and I'm going to put him in torment. This is kind of fucked up, but this is what they're telling us, that their God is, and that their God is like. Even if you want to make this point of saying, it seems a little bit unfair that God is blaming somebody else for his own fuck-ups, which is essentially what we're also talking about. That soul didn't ask to be born. Based on the mythology, that soul did not exist. Ultimately, God made a decision that he wanted to have some kind of experiment. He wanted somebody to worship him. He had self-esteem issues. He needed to be worshipped. Fair enough. I don't deprive of him that. Have at it. Because ultimately, that created existence in essence, at least based on that model. But to take that second step and create something, and to give it an illusion of free will, because yes, it's free will to a degree, but ultimately, again, you're still programming in certain biases and everything else, meaning that thing is not completely free to do whatever it wants. And ultimately, that God is going to know what that thing is going to end up doing. Whatever you've programmed into it, whatever those biases are, it's not completely free will. Like, he's an aspect of his creator, meaning if his creator fucked up, then yes, he's going to come out a particular way. The fact that God knows he's going to come out a particular way and he still lets him go that way, that seems to be somewhat of an indication of God, not the particular thing. It's almost as if God is blaming somebody else for his own fuck-ups. Is this really the God that they want to tout? I mean, because ultimately, this is the God that we're confronted with. This is one of those things where I say, like, what has to be true for this to take place? Meaning, what has to be true for the situation to which they're presenting us to have to take place? All of that has to be true for that to take place. Or there's another scenario. But I guarantee you they're going to hate this other scenario just as much as they hate the first one. This egotistical God who's blaming other people for his own fuck-ups. There's also the depowered God. God that is not omnipotent, that is not omniscient, and does not have the capability of knowing what's going to take place. That's the only way you get your particular model of Christianity. If you're going to say that your God knows, like, so ultimately, if you say, well, look, God didn't know how that was going to turn out. Ultimately, God threw those people out there and just let them have at it. All right, but you've just depowered your God. If God doesn't know, can a God be God when God doesn't know? Like, is God God when he's no longer God? At least from the eyes of our, the characteristics that we ascribe to him. And would you be okay with that particular God who didn't have that ability of knowledge or that ability of foresight? Meaning, this particular being was just powerful. He didn't necessarily have the qualities that you ascribe to God. And going beyond that, just because a being is powerful, does that mean that you should consider that thing a God? You're a being just as like any other being. What does him having magical powers have to do with him necessarily being your superior? Meaning, take it to the level of countries. Just because one country is stronger than another country, does that make that other country better than that country? No, not at all. Ultimately, it just makes him stronger. Stronger is not indicative of necessarily being better. It may be better in the confines of that very specific context. But that's it. God can kick your ass, yes. But does that mean you should recognize him as God in that sense? Meaning it's a being. It's something else that exists. It's a consciousness. It's an intelligence. In the same way that you yourself are a consciousness and an intelligence. Based on the own mythology itself. God created you. He could only create you out of things that were existence. He is everything, meaning he's creating you out to some degree of himself. Meaning, based on their own mythology, you are to some degree a shard of God. You guys, under that model, are to some degree equals. Now, yes, one is more powerful than the other, that's fair enough. But a drop of water is still water, whether it's in an ocean or whether it's in a droplet. In that context, the idea that God would need somebody to worship him, I think you guys need to evaluate what it would mean for your particular religion to be true. Or what it would mean logically. And because I'm just taking the steps logically of what does these things mean in the context of the way Christians explain their particular belief system. The things that they say about God and the qualities they ascribe to that particular God, and what would it have to mean for life to persist with that particular model. I'm making the point that that model is absolutely sadistic. And you either have one or two ways out. Either that God is depowered and he doesn't necessarily know everything. He's not necessarily omnipotent. And there are limitations. There's abilities, which means he's not just God at that point. He's just another being that has limitations like every other being. The other case is, no, you have this uber God that's all-powerful, all-present. He is complete controller of a particular reality, space, matter, time, soul. He is essentially Thanos with the gauntlet. But in that situation, you need to understand the fact that he knows everything, he's bound by that information. Knowing that information does not absolve him of having that information. Meaning, if he's making a choice that's saying, yes, I'm creating this particular life. Yes, I'm going to let this life go through an experience because I ascribe value to that particular experience. But at the end of that experience, over X number of years, I am going to put him in eternal damnation for choices that I myself knew he was going to make because I built those choices into that particular individual. That is terrifying. That is terrifying. You would think that that contradiction would be something that they would try to work out. I mean, because it's such a glaring contradiction. It's like, I kind of made this question the other day. It's like, what would have to be true for the Republicans to full well believe that stealing healthcare away from people is somehow freedom. You have the freedom to die of cancer uninsured. Well, I'm asking the same question in the sense of, what does it mean? What would it have to mean? What are the qualities that you have to ascribe to a particular being to have that knowledge and to still put something in eternal damnation that didn't exist, that he brought into existence, that he gave awareness just for the sake of giving it awareness, just for the sake, at least based on their model, of just wanting to be worshipped. He needed his ego stroked. And because that ego wasn't stroked sufficiently enough, he punitively tortures. He essentially waterboards them for eternity. If you want somebody to come to Jesus, man, that is not necessarily the pitch that you want to give. And any little bit of leaping into it, any just logical deduction of saying, well, what will have to be true for this to take place? It takes you some ghastly places. And I would almost wager that the last thing you'd want, you would probably prefer those ghastly places than ending up at the place of saying, well, God is just another being that does not have absolute knowledge. I suspect that would chill you to your bone more than God is a kid with an ant farm, and for the most part, he's a sadistic SOB. So, I love these type of thought puzzles, because it's, as you're stepping into it, you're like, all right, in order for this model of the world to work, how will this model of the world work in practice from this higher level? And that is a terrifying way for that to work, because ultimately, whether or not you end up in damnation is purely dependent upon how you were programmed. Ultimately, even if you have this idea of free will, you were still programmed. You were still given certain biases, and you were still built a particular way. The configuration of your environment, when you landed in a particular way, all of those things contributed to who you were. You do not have full agency, and there's no situation where you have absolute free will. You are constrained by your biases and by the things that were put in you. Meaning the very act of being created by God, certain biases were created in you. And those biases were going to persist themselves that God knew about in advance. And he did not fix. And ultimately, he created you. That yes, there may be a brief time in between as you live your life, but he already knows that you're going to, for eternity, live in torture and torment. That's an amazing thing. That's an amazing thing. I'm blown away that this is the teaching in that particular methodology. And it's like you have a conversation with a preacher, and that's not the conversation they want to have. That conversation is pretty damn terrifying. So, alright guys, if you enjoyed the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe, and you can always support